Thank you everyone for coming out today. Gosh, this is such a big crowd. The lights are so bright, I'm sure you're out there, but I can't really see you. I'm Petra Mayer, I'm the fiction editor at NPR Books. I'm incredibly excited to be here today with Margaret George and Philippa Gregory to talk about their new books, The Splendor Before the Dark, a novel of the Emperor Nero, and Tidelands. So just to kick us off, can each of you explain a little bit about what your book is about? Want to start?
Go first?
Yeah, you go
next
first.
To you. Well, actually, The Splendor Before the Dark is the second part. Nero books are two, and the first part of his one was his youth, the Confessions of Young Nero, but it stops right before the Great Fire of Rome. So The Splendor Before the Dark is from the most exciting things that happened in his reign, the Great Fire of Rome, and finally his downfall in the famous death scene. So it covers a lot of the things that happened in Rome. He was the last of the dynasty of Julius Caesar. So that's the fall of that famous dynasty, and it has that kind of, that's why it's The Splendor Before the Dark.
Thank you. Philippa?
Tidelands is a new departure for me. It's a new sort of book that it's no longer, I apologize to everyone who loved the Tudor and the Plantagenet books. I know you wanted another one. I'm sorry.
I was going to ask you about that.
I'm sorry. I wanted to write something completely different, and I wanted to set it in a very different place. I wanted to be away from the courts and the wealth and the politics, the big politics of England, and I wanted to go to an ordinary family, and in particular to an ordinary woman. And my heroine is a midwife in 17th century Sussex. And the land she lives in is very, very marginal. She lives in a place that's tidal. So sometimes it's land and sometimes it's sea. And she herself is marginal to the society. She's a deserted wife and a single mother. And as she works as a midwife, and as all those things mean that she's very much on the borderline of her community who suspect her of witchcraft, but at the same time need her for her herbal skills and her medicinal skills. And she's on the border of this great story which is happening in England, which is the English Civil War. I always say to American audiences, the English Civil War. We had one.
We know what Cavaliers and Roundheads are.
We had it first. And ours was better than yours. Because we actually beheaded a king, and nobody had done that before then. And we beheaded Charles I. And she's marginal to that story as well, in that she's very typical of so many people at the time, that she actually doesn't really quite understand what's going on, because there aren't the communications at the time. So what I wanted to write was a woman who is much truer to the history of most of the people, a history of ordinary people in England in 1648.
That was one of the things that I noticed about that book as I read it, was that the story existed kind of in the crevices of history and at the margins. Is there a freedom that you have to write there that you don't have if you're writing about historical figures who we all know about?
There's a freedom when you write fiction, and this, although it's a historical fiction, it's set in a very clear and well-researched period of time, but it is a fictional character. So I'm free with her in a way that I simply, you simply can't be free with someone whose story is on the record. And you're not even free with the ones whose story isn't recorded, because you have the sort of parameters of the reality of their life to work inside. But with a completely fictional character, I keep her inside verisimilitude, but I don't say she's got to do there is no record, there is no written record of a specific midwife in this period. Everything we have is composite.
And I actually wanted to ask a little bit about that, because you talk about keeping her within the bounds of verisimilitude, and I was really fascinated with the worlds that both of you built, and I wanted to ask about your research process, because that's my thing. I love world building. So, when I was reading Tidelands, I felt like I could smell the marsh, and when I was reading Splendor Before the Dark and the Confessions of Young Nero, I could see the gauzy draperies and the light on the marble. So could you each talk a little bit about how you researched your books, because it must be a much different process, ancient Rome versus an era when there are still some records.
Well, ancient Rome, of course, parts of it still exist. And someone once said, if you want to see what ancient Rome looked like, come to Washington, D.C. Because we have more intact, more buildings in that style than has survived in Rome itself, because Rome itself had the Renaissance on top of it and the Baroque. And so, yes, if you want to see a lot of beautiful white buildings with columns, come here. But
our forum is better.
Yeah.
Royal forum.
Right. But I do think that you have to go to the places where your character lived, outside of Rome, because anybody can go to the Colosseum, and you don't have the experience of what it was like then, because for one thing, there are scores of tourists and little ticket takers
and
everywhere.
guys dressed as centurions, yeah.
Right, but by going to places outside of Rome, like his birthplace, Antium, and the ruins of the villa there, and he had another villa that he was very proud of that he built up in the hills, and there are ruins of that up there, and there's really nobody around. And so I think that way you really connect with the character and what his life was like, much more than just beyond just the reading. Of course, you do have to do the reading, but I'm a firm believer in the atmosphere of going to a place.
So you actually went to the places and
Yes.
kind of walked in his steps. What
Yes.
did that feel like?
It was really exciting because I felt like I had him all to myself. There was no one else there, so you could kind of commune with the ghosts.
It's a little creepy, but also fascinating. Can you tell me a little bit about your research process?
I mean, I agree completely. You have to be there. I always go to everywhere that I write about, which includes in England, of course, some really well-known places like Hampton Court and Windsor Castle. And in this case, in the case of the Tidelands, this is it's a small harbour on the English south coast that I knew very well anyway. I lived there for about 4 years when I was in my 20s. So there was a very familiar background for me there. But the research is always, people often say to me, how do you do it? Is there like a trick? Is there a sort of a hack for research? And for me, it's just mostly reading. It's just tons and tons and tons of reading. And occasionally, I'll speak to historians of a particular aspect of the period. And sometimes then I'll say, like, what's the controversy? What's the thing that we are quarreling about, we as historians are quarreling about now? And that's always very interesting because it's usually the thing that we can't agree now, which is the most interesting part of the story then. But research is partly visits, but more than anything else, it's reading, which is a good thing to say at a book festival, really. But I particularly like saying it to young students who go like, surely you just find someone who knows about it and they tell you. And you go, no, you actually read the book.
But now I want to know, what was the controversy that you got that was at the heart of Tidelands when you talk about asking people what they were quarreling about, what historians were quarreling about? I mean, I know what the Cavaliers and the Roundheads were quarreling about.
Oh, the great historian of the Civil War said, when asked what was the result of it, said in this century, it's too early to tell. That in a sense, many of the divisions of England even today, maybe you find the divisions in your own society between a sort of a popular upswelling of sense of injustice and wanting a fairer share of what we called then the commons, the common lands, and the sense that the country was owned by an elite who were running it for their own satisfaction. There's a lot of people who would feel that in England today, and would, I think, probably be right to feel that in England today. And we've still not resolved how to run a society for the benefit of many.
Which leads me to kind of a question for both of you. I read a lot of genre fiction, and what people always say is that it's a lens through which we can look at the issues of the present. Were you thinking about writing books that would be in conversation with present issues, or were you just thinking, hey, this is a good story?
Well, probably a little of both. I felt that of all things, Nero was a very oddly modern character. I was drawn to his character because he, alone of the Roman emperors, we know a lot about him as a person, but he truly did want to be an artist. And I've known so many people, and I bet everybody in this room knows someone like this, who wanted to be a musician, they wanted to be a writer, they wanted to be an artist, but instead they had to go to like pharmacy school or something to make a living. And I feel that he had to be emperor. I mean, there were too many people had died to make him emperor, and it's not
Yeah,
like
thanks,
he can.
Agrippina.
It's not like he can say, I don't want that job. I want to be a musician. So he had this pull that so many modern people have, and that gave me real access to him. And I think we never have really quite solved that because many more people want to be artists than society can support. And yet there's plenty of, we always need another accountant somewhere. And so you have to think of your own livelihood, you have to support yourself, and you can't necessarily indulge what you would like to do. You have that tension all the time.
I think the present and the past is actually there in my study. It's not that I go, I want to write a novel which takes issue with some of the present issues. It's I can't shut the door on it. My job as a historical novelist is to enter into a period in the past. But I absolutely know when I look at my own novels that anybody reading it would know that I had been educated at Sussex University sometime in the 1980s. You know, the interests. I mean, just writing about women's history is an incredibly time-limited thing. You don't find novels in which women are real agents of the story and real agents of the history, acknowledged as that, any time before the 1950s. And even then, the historical novels of the 1950s are extraordinarily Freudian in their explanation of what anybody does. So it's a delight. You pick up any historical novel and you get two periods of time. You get the period that the author is trying to immerse you in, and you get the period that they lived in. And you can't escape your own consciousness. Even as a writer, imagining that you're someone else, you're still yourself imagining that you're someone else. So of course, my novel is about a woman who is at the very limits of survival in her society. So of course she's a woman who is oppressed and challenged almost every day by her circumstances. And of course that makes you think about women who in the modern world, in our world today, are challenged and oppressed. And of course that comes into it, that's part of the energy of the novel. But I try very hard not to be anachronistic in any way. I don't, in a sense, drag in the politics like a cat bringing in a dead bird. You know, like, you will be interested in this because I am interested in this. It's very important to me that what comes up in the novel is authentic to that period.
I think that we can't help, though, revealing what era we're writing, even though we don't realize it. Like movies, you can date when a historical movie is made by, you know the 1950s.
By the makeup and the hairdos?
The makeup and the hairdos and the attitudes toward, social things. So even though they're trying to be authentic, they really end up revealing, mirroring the times they're written in and, filmed in. And so we probably do more of it than we'd like to. we probably try to get away from it, but it's hard. It's very hard.
Well, that's why historiography is so interesting, because I always like to see what people of different eras think about the past and how that changes their approach. Nero himself was sort of a victim of historiography, I think.
Oh, yes.
When we think of Nero, we sort of mash him up with Commodus and Caligula, and we think, oh, he fiddled while Rome burned, but apparently not.
Well, yeah, it's unfortunate that the surviving three main histories about him were hostile to him. It's sort of as if it was, reporters that had it in for him, but also he didn't fiddle while Rome burned. The Great Fire of Rome was a defining thing in his life, and he actually wasn't even there. It was a terrible fire. It burned for 9 days, and it destroyed about most of Rome. It had, out of 14 regions, only 4 survived. And so if they say it was the greatest urban destruction before World War II with the bombing. But he did everything he could afterward for relief for the people. He threw open the palace grounds, and he got food down from other parts of Italy. But he was blamed for it, or people started saying he had fiddled, not at the time, but that he performed his ode to the fall of Troy, because he had a thing about Troy, and he had written an epic about Troy, and it's true that he played the Cythera, so they assumed the backdrop was just too good to give up. That he just couldn't resist it. He had to get up on and play, and that's all just, fake news. But they had fake news then. They've always had fake news. So And it just was, it really stuck to him. And I think it really bothered him because, you know, the truth was the opposite.
Why do you think he got such a bad rap?
Well, because I think also, the common people loved him. We have to set that straight. Common people loved him. And in fact, the emperor who succeeded him said, he will always be missed by the riffraff. He was more at home with the common people. And the historians reporting on him were sympathetic to the Old Republic and the Senate. And so they didn't understand even what he was all about, but they also were hostile to him because he was actually more at home with the common people than he was with his own class, and that didn't fly real well.
I feel like class was kind of the thing that did him in because it was so low class for an emperor to go on
class
stage.
did him in, you know, the chariot racing. Well, Tacitus talks about the wildest improprieties, and it turns out to be chariot racing and acting. And so, you know, that were considered just, you know, too lowly for an emperor.
What I really want to know, though, was he any good as an artist?
Well, that's very, you know, you're asking the key question, and one historian had said, the tragedy for him is he would never know. And we can't know because he couldn't get an honest judgment at the time ever. And I think any artist, any writer, any musician, you do want to know, you know, are you good? How good are you? Or whatever, but he could never get that answer. Well, only 4 lines of his poetry survive, and none of his music. The only thing that survives is the architecture with the Golden House, which is his magnificent achievement in the middle of Rome. However, he got blamed for starting the fire of Rome, supposedly so he could build this, so he just couldn't win. But that's the only proof we have of whatever artistic talent he had. And now people really appreciate it. They've opened it to the public now after many years of it being shut up.
I think that was the most surprising thing to me about reading the book was that, you know, because I also had this sort of standard negative view of him, that he had this passion for art and that he may have actually had a talent for it. And one of the things I love about doing research and digging into stories are the surprises that come up. So what was, and this is a question for both of you, what was the most surprising thing that you did not expect you would discover when you were digging into these worlds?
Well, that he was athletic. You know, it's because of that Peter Ustinov, speaking of the 1950s, the Peter Ustinov portrayal of him in Quo Vadis, but he really was quite athletic as a young man. And of course, he was always a young man because he died when he was 30. So, you know, that surprised me because you just don't think of Nero competing, you don't think of him wrestling, you don't think of him racing or any of those things. And so I enjoyed discovering that, I really did.
I was trying to think what was surprising. I mean, in a way, the oppression of women in medieval society never comes as a surprise because you know that's how medieval society runs. But the extent of it is quite surprising. I suppose the one single thing that was news to me was the fact that Henrietta Maria, who is the Queen of Charles I, who in English school histories is Catholic, and English school, especially Church of England primary schools, tend to rather look down on Catholics. So she, you know, that's strike one against her. She was very authoritative with her husband and bossed him about. So that's strike two, Henrietta Maria. We don't like bossy little women, which is a pity, since so many of us are. But the thing that you know, she's absolutely sort of registered in traditional history as a poor advisor, and indeed partly the cause of the English Civil War, and certainly the cause of her husband's undoing, since she urges him to go to battle and strike his standard and not negotiate with the Houses of Parliament. But actually, what I didn't know about her was that she lands in England under cannon fire, and she gets her troops on land, and then she marches around the north of England and the Midlands as a Queen militant. And I simply didn't know that until I came to research it. It's not very well known. she was actually far more courageous and enterprising than the history books allow, and it is, as usual, that the heroism of women is seen as them interfering, and the heroism of men is praised to the skies. But it's a very interesting example of the way that the slight bias of history through the generations absolutely obscures some really interesting women.
I actually had no idea about that either. I mean, she's always kind of portrayed as this little mousy
person
in the background.
Yeah.
You have written so much about royalty in the past. What made you decide that it was time to write about somebody who was distinctly not royal?
I wrote about royalty very much as an accident. And I wrote about royalty because what I was interested in was women of history. And the only way you can find out really easily about anything about women in history is if they are related to someone who is so important that his movements are recorded. And then at least you've got a fighting chance of knowing where they were. I mean, it's really striking. We don't even know the birth date of Anne Boleyn. And you would think we know so much about Anne Boleyn. We don't even know when she was born, because when she was born, she was just another Tudor girl of not much interest or importance to anybody. And after she rose to be queen, nobody bothered to really look up and find out her date of birth. So there are so many women of such huge interest who play such a big part in English history that we simply don't know the first things about. And the only way to find anything about them was if, in the case of someone like Elizabeth Woodville, when she married Edward IV, from then on, her movements are recorded because she's mostly with the king, or in the case of poor Elizabeth Woodville, pregnant. So you know where she is for most of the time because you know where the babies are born. So that's really the way that I got into the royal women. I started with Anne Boleyn and her sister, the other Boleyn girl, Mary Boleyn, and they led me from just an absolute interest in their world to Catherine of Aragon, and that led me out of an interest in her mother-in-law to Henry Tudor's wife, Elizabeth, and from her to Elizabeth Woodville. And you can see that just from one character to another, all of them women, their stories lead you to another story until at the end of it I come up 20 years later and realised I'd become a specialist of English royalty. Which is a bit unfortunate because I am by nature and spirit anti-monarchy. So, in the meantime, people ask me to comment on royal weddings and talk about them, and they are the most boring people in England. And it's very, and I'm continually saying I have no interest in them. I'm only interested in tyrants, really. So I'm interested in the Boleyns, and I'm interested in the Plantagenets, and I'm interested in the Tudors, but when you get to the Windsors, it's hardly worth it. It's really not worth the trouble. However, it always was women, and so when I decided that I would take a major change, this at last gives me the chance to look at common women, and although I know I'm not going to be able to find a single woman's story to follow through the historical record, what I can do is I can look at something like a woman who is a midwife, because I can follow the stories of midwives through the multiple records, most of them criminal, because most of them come out of witchcraft trials. So there's a lot of recordings about what men think women were doing when they think they were witches, which is of no use historically because it's all imaginary. However, it does tell you a lot about what the women were doing in their normal lives. So it says that on such and such a day, Goody, whatever her name is, came to the rich man's gate and asked if she could borrow a quart of milk. And when he said no, and she went away, and she said under her breath, "Well, damn you." And he then says, "That's a curse. She's a witch." And then she's on trial. So although all of the evidence at the trial is truly male sexual fantasy and fiction, the events running up to the trial often give you a real insight into these poor women who were subsequently trapped and burned.
And those two things are really intersecting in your book, the changing nature of poverty in England at that time and the growing fear of witchcraft and women's power. And they really sort of come together in the character of Eleanor, I think. the way that she is very liminal in her village. I don't want to give too much for the plot away, but can you tell us, besides what was going on with the Civil War, what are the other social issues that are at play in her world?
Well, in England, as in Europe at this time, there is a sort of a desire, especially in England because of Protestantism, there's a desire to make the management of poverty more regular, and there's an anxiety about the unruly poor. And so the idea that women can be in harvesting gangs, as there were in the Elizabethan period, where scores of women at a time would travel the country as a gleaning gang or a harvesting gang and get drunk and behave badly and have parties. I mean, it sounds really good fun.
It does sound fun, honestly.
Well, that had to stop, obviously. We can't have that. So there's a whole degree of control which bears down upon women through the medieval period, where they are increasingly made responsible for interior work. They're increasingly enclosed for the benefit of the ambition of men and the safety of the streets. At the same time as you've got this going on, you've got the idea that poverty is something which should be resolved not by individual gifts to your neighbours, but it should be something which is organised, and there should be a parish overseer, which means that the poor now have to apply for poor relief. You can't just turn up at your neighbour's door and ask them to help you out anymore. So it's a very alienating experience, and it's part of the class divide. So the wealthy retreat more and more behind their park gates, which later on in the next century will become grander and more enclosed and more beautiful parkland. And the poor are more and more confined to poverty-stricken areas, which, as it will come as no surprise to anybody, isn't very beneficial for them, but is part of, in a sense, the organising of England into a very stratified society.
And the Tidelands is such an interesting place. Did the character come first, the story come first, or the setting? Because the setting is so liminal, the character is so liminal, they're all of a piece almost.
As I was writing the setting of it, I realised that I was describing a landscape. It's a landscape that I really love, but that the landscape itself was almost a character. So the sea comes in and out every day, and the rhythm of everybody's life is based upon the sea. There's a tide mill, which is a construction. I don't know, do you have them in America? Did you have them? I don't think so.
We don't really have tidelands.
Oh, you
Correct
do.
me if I'm wrong.
Oh, you have tidelands?
Yes. Oh, I am totally wrong. Thank you for correcting me.
Well, I know you do, because I have American readers saying, I know the sort of countryside you're talking about, because it's outside my window, so I do know that.
I'm from here. We don't have tidelands in D.C., so there, I'm right about that.
I'm glad we got that. A tide mill is a mill which operates exactly like a water mill, except the mill pond is filled by the tide. So when the tide comes in, it flows into the pond, the sluice gates close as the tide recedes, and then the miller opens the sluice to the mill, and the water flows out of the tide mill pond, turns the wheel, and grinds the corn. So there used to be hundreds of tide mills in the UK, it being a very big coastal area. And now there's only 2 working mills in the whole of England. And I went to one of them and met the miller and had one of the most comical conversations of historical research I've ever had. So I said to him, first of all, I didn't want to offend him. He's a very, very devoted miller, working the only working tide mill in the UK. So this is a key element in my research. So I talked to him about the water filling up in the pond and the fact that you have to mill whenever the tide is low, even if it's in the middle of the night. So he sometimes comes to the mill and mills flour at night, and we went up to the top of the mill and down to the bottom until I understood all the levers and the pulleys and that. And then we went outside and we looked at this huge, rather ominous, weedy green wheel and the great big deep ditch that it turns in for the water. And I said to him, if you were going to put a woman on the wheel to, as it were, drown her, how would you do that? And he looked at me in utter horror and he said, nobody in my dozens of years of being a miller has asked me such a thing. This is a tide mill. And I said, yeah, I know, but say you were. And he said, well, how heavy is she? So we then had a conversation about how you would dip a woman on a tide mill, which, again, not to give away too much, but you will see that it was time well spent.
How many customers does this man have? I mean, does he actually mill enough to keep himself?
Oh, well, he's kind of a curator of this mill museum. And you can buy flour there, and he does buy flour there, but he's going to have more.
I hope nobody asks him about drowning anybody on the water wheel anymore. I do want to sort of continue on the theme of writing about women, because when I was reading the Nero books, I felt like the one real driver of who he became, both as a man and as a myth, is his mom, Agrippina.
Yes, also in his life, women were very important. And I only realized that the other day when I was sort of compiling a list of the people close to him. So there's his mother, Agrippina, of course, who was the ambitious woman who saw that her only son could become emperor and brought it about through all of her various schemes and so on, which included marrying her uncle Claudius and then poisoning him and so on. But he also, one of his rebellious things as a child, as a teenager, he did fall in love with this freed woman, a former slave, and he wanted to marry her. And at that point, he didn't have the political savvy that he later grew up to have, where he could have married her. But they stayed very close his whole life, and in fact, he willed some things to her. I went to an interesting exhibit that had things from her. He set her up in business, and she had a tile factory and other things. And she was the one who buried him. She was the one who gave him his funeral. She was older than he was. Then his wife, Poppaea, she was also older than he was. And they were both, she was rather bossy, and you wonder, he liked older, strong women, obviously, and his last wife was the same way. And yes, I think that she obviously was the most dominant influence on his whole life, but he had this love-hate thing with her because she was so overbearing and, again, would want him to be something he didn't want to be, but she was a very magnetic, strong personality, very clever. They say, actually, speaking of women and their roles, is that, of course, in Rome, women had no political office. They could not hold a political office, so you get these strong women kind of behind the scenes, but they were not allowed a part really in public life. And so you get people like Agrippina and Livia who were very influential, but frustrated because they had to work through their sons or their husbands all the time.
I almost sometimes think she's the villain of the story in a way, because you talk about sort of, it's not a spoiler, we all know Nero bumped his mom off, right? That's not a spoiler. But you talk about that event as bringing forth Dark Nero.
Yeah, the Dark Nero.
Tell us a little bit about the Dark Nero.
It was like he had that side of him that he had to let exist so he could exist, because if he didn't have that for self-protection, he would have been doomed. But I don't think he liked it. But on the other hand, it was like people that hire the Godfather. There's that side that he had to keep alive, but he kind of wanted to put it in the closet when he didn't need it.
Very good at compartmentalizing, because he did do some things that were objectively fairly monstrous.
Yes.
When you talk about how you think he wanted to keep that separate and wanted to hide it, is there anything in the historical record about that, or is that your feeling about the character?
It was my feeling about the character that there were really three of him. Mm-hmm. There was the son of Augustus, who was the daylight emperor, and when he started out as a young emperor, and he wore the Augustus haircut. As he he ditched the Augustus haircut and grew his hair long. But he, for a while, would do his daylight duties. He was very dutiful. Then there was the artistic one that wanted to be an artist and have long hair, and then there was the dark one who kind of was the person who made the other two possible. And I don't think it wasn't actually a split personality, but they all kind of coexisted together, and he had favorites. I think we have favorite sides and sides that we wish we didn't have. But I think he came to accept that they all three were necessary.
How much is left of his actual life, of his sayings, of his words? Is it just the 4 lines of poetry?
The 4 lines of poetry, which aren't even from the same poem.
Oh,
so you can't
gosh.
judge them because there's no context. One thing is that the coinage under his reign was the highest that Rome ever achieved. Beautiful coins that are prized by collectors. And the other thing about him that's odd is he just let himself be portrayed as he was. As he got heavier, he was very stunningly good looking as a young, well, he was always young, as I said, but he put on weight and he got a double chin and everything. And the coins show this. And you can tell almost, if you didn't even have the date on it, you could tell when they were minted. And those are beautiful, though, all those coins, including huge sesterces, which are beautifully done. So I would say the Golden House, the artistry of the Golden House, the coins, and those are really the things of him that remain that you can judge now. You're not seeing it through the lenses of someone else's judgment.
Because of course that's how we mostly see him now. When we were emailing back and forth before this conversation, you said something about how you thought he was just out of time. He was in the wrong time.
Yeah, it's like some of the things that he was condemned for, the Emperor Hadrian did. I mean, the Emperor Hadrian was a great lover of Greece. He also was a lover of art. He wore long hair, and he had a male lover. But we love Hadrian. Everybody loves Hadrian. But that was 50, 60 years after Nero. And so I just think that some of the things he was condemned for, especially the artistry, nobody would bat an eye about it, 60 years later.
What do you think changed? Just time passed?
I just think fashions change like they do with us. You think about how in the last 20 years, think about same-sex marriage, think about the fact that we're talking a lot about race now and slavery, many things, in just that small amount of time, not to mention women's role in things. It's amazing how things can change, not overnight, but fairly fast when they start to change, don't you think?
Mm.
I'm being told that we have 15 minutes left, so I would like to ask you both one last question, and then maybe we can get some questions from the audience. And this is something I like to ask all authors. What do you want people to come away from your book with? How do you want them to feel? What do you want them to think?
You go first.
Well, I never write a book wanting to tell anybody anything. And a tremendous number of people, and it makes me very happy, read the books and then go on to read the historical background or go on to read history itself as a subject. And indeed, I have a growing number of people who have gone to university having been inspired by my books, and they come up to me at signings, and it's so lovely. I actually feel like I have my own little university and I should be graduating them. But really, what I've just spent, usually when I come to a book, I've spent 2 or 3 years trying to write a really good novel. And all I want them to do is to close the book and go like, that was a really good novel. I really enjoyed that. If they felt that it was superbly well written, that would be nice. And if they feel like that they have seen a reflection of human nature, that they have got to some kind of truth, or a lot of people seem to read the books and reflect on their own lives when they look at the survival and the courage of women of the past, and that's very rewarding for me also. But really, I just want them to feel they've, read a good book and they'll buy the next one.
Fair enough.
I think I wanted to portray his life almost like a Shakespearean tragedy. And they say that at the end of a tragedy, you're supposed to be left with a sense of woe and wonder. And if I've succeeded in doing that, that's what I was trying to do.
I think you did.
Thank you.
I had no idea he was such a tragic, frustrated artist. All right, well, are there there's some microphones here in each aisle if people want to come up and ask a couple of questions. Now is the time. Come on, y'all, do my job for me. They're right back there in the middle of each aisle. I see you right there. Hi.
Hi, thank you for spending some time with us. Writing historical fiction, do you find more challenges when you are trying to put the words in the mouths of historical individuals or in the composite fictionalized individuals in the books that you create?
Is that for both of us?
Yeah, well, you both have both. You both have actual historical figures, and you have composite fictionalized characters as well.
I think it's probably easier to put them in the mouths of a real person because that person already kind of has a track record of what they say, and you already know what the character is like, so it's easier to imagine what else they might say on a topic. I think doing it for the fictional person, you're creating it from the beginning, and you have to get the feel for it. Would you say?
For me, I think I feel it's a discovery. It's a process of a discovery. To get a character's voice is probably the biggest thing that I have to do. With it, when it's a known character, you have sometimes very, very hardly ever for women, but sometimes you have a note of what they actually say, and that's really lovely to weave into their speech if you can. And I always feel like if someone knows the history and they recognize it, then that's really good fun. But if they don't, then it shouldn't hold them up. It should be seamless. Thank you.
Thank you. I see somebody over there, yeah.
Hi, you both write about characters that are relatively well known, or even famous. Do you ever start to look at a person and say, people are too invested in this person, they feel like they know them too well for me to try to take them on?
I've never, because I write about women, I've never, except possibly Elizabeth I and Mary I, they're the only ones that people really, Mary Queen of Scots, they're the only ones that people really think they know about. And most of what people think they know about those women is, I think, incorrect, because there have been a tremendous number of hagiographies. They're not histories, they're just fan letters, really. So it's always a pleasure, actually, to take on someone who's quite well known and see if you can see another aspect of their lives.
Yeah, I agree. I'd say the same. I'd say that the fun is finding that they're different from what people think, and you discover new things, and maybe you can bring new things out about them.
Thank you very much. Let's go back to the other side over there. If you want to ask a question, come up to the mic. Otherwise, we can't hear you.
So, how do you guys feel with portraying queer or LGBT characters in your writing? For example, the one time Nero kidnapped a guy and forced him to dress up as his wife because he looked like his wife who had just died. Okay, yeah, I'm good.
Well, you know, I think it was, I think it was also a grief. He wanted to recreate his wife again, so it's probably a little closer to necrophilia. Hate to say it, but anyway, that it was, you know, the same-sex thing, but that it was much more accepted then anyway. I think what people thought was odd about it was that he tried to make the person into his wife, which was sort of like Vertigo, and which he even called him by his wife's name, and he would wear, you know, so I think that was the kinky part, which it still would be today, I think.
I think the issue about queer and LGBTQ characters generally is that there isn't, for me, enough historical research done yet. Thankfully, it's being done. People are working on it all the time. But particularly lesbianism is almost invisible in the history, because you then get into the fascinating, but I'm sure we don't have time for it here, question of what is lesbian behavior in a historical context when women are sleeping together, and it's not even questioned. They're walking, you know, Jane Austen's heroines, who are clearly what people say lesbian-like. So they're tremendously physically intimate, but we don't know whether intercourse takes place. And then you go like, well, why should intercourse, which we usually understand as being a sort of traditionally a male-female choreographed experience, why should that be the defining activity for two women? So that's complicated and also early in the day, but I think the question of lesbianism and LGBTQ in historical fiction is really going to have to wait until it's more understood in history.
Thank you for the question. You guys are up next.
Good afternoon and welcome to DC.
Thank you.
My question refers to the actual historical research involved, and how do you address your critics that tell you got it historically inaccurate?
Because there's always somebody.
There's always somebody. Well, I think you just try to do, as Philippa was saying, you do a lot of research in your reading, and you try to use the sources that are the most reliable, and that's as far as you can go. And if someone disagrees, at least you can say to yourself and to them too that you certainly turned over every stone that you could, pretty much, and you didn't really overlook much. So I think there's a kind of a security in that, security blanket in that.
When someone writes to me and says that I got something wrong, if I did get it wrong, and if it's something like where somebody landed on a voyage, I alter it in the next edition because I'd rather be right than wrong. And actually don't go mad, but I often send them like a signed book to say thank you because it's helpful. When somebody says that something's wrong when actually it's right, I just grind my teeth.
Thank you. Next, you guys.
Yes, this is for both authors, but I know your side characters specifically, well, not side characters, but your non-historically like significant characters, like in Tidelands for Philippa, as well as also in The Queen's Fool is one of that particularly. How do you choose the characters to create the story around where they are in historical context but are not necessarily written about? How do you select those characters and build the story?
The fictional characters, sometimes in the case of The Queen's Fool, there was a fool, a female fool who worked in the places that my fictional character worked. So she was really the starting point for me because I didn't realize that it was possible to have a female fool. So that was like a real breakthrough moment for me, and just in so many ways so inspiring to have a woman that close to power who is sanctioned to speak out. I mean, that's an extraordinary role for a woman to play in the medieval world. And my character, Eleanor in Tidelands, in a way she too is, although she's a composite character, she's slightly outside her society, which of course makes her interesting. Thank you.
Did you have anything to add, Margaret?
I
didn't want to move on until you'd had your say.
I don't think that I really use many characters that didn't exist. I know in Mary Queen of Scots, I think I had 4 out of 200. And in Nero, I made up the names of 3 senators who exist only to present a bill to somebody. Generally, they are real characters.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I think we can take a couple more questions. How about you there?
2 of the authors today talked about their research or their work and laying out literally pieces of it on the floor and reorganizing them to be able to write their books. And I'm curious about how you dealt with all of your research and then organized it into the book itself.
I think you're talking about David Brooks. I think we heard the same talk this morning. Well, I don't do that, but I do. I think you just start. I actually take notes in a notebook by hand, and I also use 4x6 cards. Very old-fashioned, but somehow the act of writing it enters your brain. And of course, I have a structure because I have the chronology that I kind of do have to stick to. Like you said, there are things that happened and you have to have. But again, of course, the point of view and the structure and the way that you organize it is how you tell the story. And that's the hardest part, I think, the structure. How are you going to present these things that you now know these facts, but how are you going to structure them almost like, like screenplays? You've got to have a certain cohesiveness, but there's also people can move chronology around to make it more interesting. Oh, I think that's the hardest. Once you have that, you have it's much easier to flow.
I think also, especially writing historical fiction, I have the sense that I have enormous files of material, and I have books and books and books all around me, but it's the stuff that sticks in my mind that I remember that's going to be the valuable stuff in the story, and how important it is when writing historical fiction not to gift the reader your many hours of tedious study. You know, they don't want that. If they wanted many hours of tedious study, they could do it themselves directly. I think as a novelist, it's really important that it works as a novel.
Thank you.
Thanks.
One more question, I guess.
Okay. My question, I guess, is for both of you. When you decided to write historical fiction, did your love of history come first, or did your love of writing come first? And would you guys ever branch out into other genres?
Oh, okay. Well, I always loved history, but I was more fascinated. My first book was about King Henry VIII, and I was fascinated by this character. And so I wanted to explore, actually I wanted to do all 6 wives, and then I realized I would be duplicating material all the time. So I think that, but I'm interested in other genres. I'm really interested in writing plays. I've studied screenwriting. I would not ever write short stories, though. It's just not in my genes. I can't write anything that's short. Have an end. So I think it's fun to explore. I'm starting to play with some other genres, but I think my natural is a really long narrative.
I think I'm a storyteller, absolutely, in my sort of genes, and I observe that I like to tell stories and I like people to tell me stories. So I like the narrative circle of a well-told story. But I have an absolute passion for history, and I'm very blessed that there is a form, an art form, which combines both things equally. And that's where I've spent my life, and I can't imagine doing one with the exclusion of the other. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question, nice timekeeper lady, or are we done? One more. Okay, one more. You there.
Hi. So when you're doing your research, if it's a well-known historical figure, do you find it necessary to go back into the historical records yourself, or do you get the information you need from biographies that are already there?
Well, that's the difference between primary research and secondary research, and I can't do primary research because I'm not trained to do that. It does take a special kind of training, and so I rely on other historians, real historians, to what they publish in academia, and I use their work. I try to have a wide variety of it, so I get a lot of different opinions, but I'm just not qualified to do primary research.
And for me, it depends very much what I'm working on. Sometimes the material is there and it's been published. For example, material about the Tudors. People have been working on the Tudors almost since they were themselves. Certainly the Victorians are Tudor mad. So there's a whole load of Victorian writers about the Tudors who bring to the Tudors all of their Victorian prejudices. So you have to read through what they say about the characters. And sometimes I do have to go to people's letters, and especially the archives of sometimes the royal letters, Henry letters, or papers of state, because sometimes you get an impression from that I wrote a novel called Three Sisters, Three Queens, about, in particular, Margaret of Scotland, Queen Margaret of Scotland. And there in the archives are the letters that her brother Henry wrote to her and about her, and her replies to him. There's something incredibly powerful when you can get somebody's own words to read them. So that's pretty exciting, but most of the time, secondary material is enough for the work I'm doing, yeah.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you to Margaret George and Philippa Gregory for being with us today, and thank all of you. And yes, thank you.